My name is Clark Banack. I'm the director of the Alberta Centre for Sustainable Rural Communities at the Augustana campus of the University of Alberta, something like Alberta's version of RDI. My name's on the program, but I'm actually just going to be up here for about 90 seconds quickly introducing our real presenters and the project that we're doing. This is something that the government of Alberta approached us to do. They wanted us to do a bit of a deep dive on kind of the challenges inherent around farm succession in Alberta, of course they're interested in Alberta, but it's very much kind of a prairie-wide common issue. Everyone's probably heard of the numbers out there that they'll probably tell them to you how few farmers on the prairies actually have succession plans. And the Alberta government was actually interested in this. It kind of surprised me. They framed their interest as a rural development question. And the reason it surprised me was I don't think they really care, or at least don't really understand rural development, at least in the way I think most of us in the room do. But nevertheless, that's how they pitched it to us. And they said, look, if fewer and fewer farmers succeed in transitioning their farm within their family, it obviously increases the likelihood that it will just be bought up by a larger farm, and we'll continue to see farm consolidation happening in Alberta, and that means less families living in rural Alberta. So that's how they pitched it to us. One last thing I'll say, though, is it was almost like the Amazing Race. They said, here's your goal, but by the way, we're going to put up this really weird barrier. We want you to answer this question for us, but you're not allowed to talk to farmers. And I'll tell you that later. Don't get me started. But anyway, so that's a little bit of the context in terms of the direction we went to try and get some answers to this question. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Serena Isley, who is a full-time research associate at our center, and Sydney Sherrif, who is a research assistant with us.
Well, thank you, Clark, for that introduction. So just before we begin, we're going to dive into our study and findings, and we want to briefly introduce the topic of succession, which has kind of gained a lot of traction and attention recently, especially in the Canadian prairies. One key reason for this growing interest among academics and policymakers is the significant generational shift approaching in the agriculture that Clark kind of alluded to. Over 60% of Canadian farmers are over the age of 55, yet only 14% have a formal succession plan in place. This highlights an urgent need for us to better understand the complex nature of farm succession, including the emotional, legal, and financial aspects, and how to identify actionable strategies that support successful transition and ensure the future of agriculture in rural communities. This is especially critical in the prairie provinces of Saskatchewan, Alberta, and Manitoba, where 82.3% of Canada's farmland is located. So this brought us to our primary objective, and that was to understand the current state of farm succession in the prairies. From this, two research questions sort of emerged and were posed. What are the key trends and challenges to farm succession, and what are some of the potential solutions to support farm succession? To address our research questions, we used a qualitative descriptive approach to conduct semi-structured interviews with ag experts in the legal, financial, and consulting fields. Our subsample of 23 participants included legal professionals, financial advisors, and succession-specific experts. And as for our key findings, which Serena will take us through here in a moment, we found these three themes kind of emerge from the data. These included the complexities of succession planning, information and implementation gaps, and ensuring successful succession. And now Serena will very graciously take us through that, what each of those mean.
Thanks, Sydney. Oh my goodness, I'm short. Sorry. Okay, so kind of starting off with our first theme here, which was complexities of planning, and I'll just take us through three of the sub-themes as well. So with this first one here, it was all about emotions and conflict. So from our interviews, we found that succession planning on farms wasn't just about finances or the legal documents. It's a deeply personal process that carries a lot of emotional weight. There are a lot of decisions that can impact the future of both entering and exiting generations. These included factors like who the farm would be passed to, where the successor would live, and most importantly, what fairness or equality meant in terms of asset distribution and changing of hands with those incoming and exiting farmers. The next complex piece here was language and definitions. So the vernacular used to describe this process was quite complex and challenging. We found that there were many inconsistencies in language used to describe the transfer of land from one generation to the next. Participants pointed out that terms like succession and transition were used often interchangeably, but they carried different emotional and practical meanings. And frequently, they were not associated with the legal documents or the formal writing of a succession plan. This lack of clarity in language often led to avoidance of these important conversations, or even just a misunderstanding of what this transfer of land meant. So the last piece of this complexity theme here is financial pressures. So farmland values are skyrocketing, as many of you know, and especially in the prairies. And this makes it much more difficult for that older generation to retire and the younger generation to buy in. Some participants shared that the cost of succession planning could range quite considerably, anywhere in the ballpark of $5,000 to get a plan in place to up to $50,000. And for farmers, this was a big sticker shock, and of course was seen as a barrier to beginning that planning process. The next theme I'll dive into here is the information and implementation gaps. So starting off with our sub-theme of education and learning opportunities. So in terms of information available, there's a lot of information available that farmers frequently rely on. However, it's usually informal. This includes conversations with neighbors or even their bank tellers in their local communities. And while these sources are trusted and easily accessible for farmers, they often lack the depth of the legal and financial expertise that's needed for successful and effective planning. We also found that there was a lot of formal educational resources available too. And this included online guides and workshops offered by various agricultural organizations and businesses. However, it was explained by interviewees that sometimes these materials can be a little bit too generic and that they offer more of a high level or broad scenario that don't quite address the unique needs of individual farms. On the flip side though, some of the other resources available online tended to be overly complex. These featured lengthy 50 to 300 page documents that were often filled with technical jargon and quite frankly overwhelming for farmers to sit down and read through. Lastly, the style of delivery and the tone really mattered. However, there was polarizing opinions on this, so some of our interviewees described the importance of information to be presented in clear and relatable language with an overall positive and supportive tone tended to work well. Whereas other interviewees described how fear-based or horror story discourses would really help initiate the planning process, simply because farmers did not want the same thing to happen to them. So with all of those being said, and all of the information available, farmers often felt overwhelmed, and this led to delayed decision making. Farmers would often postpone succession conversations because of them feeling overwhelmed by the sheer volume and complexity of information available. With so many resources, ranging from the informal advice from their bank teller to those detailed 300-page workbooks, this made it really difficult for farmers to know where to start and which guidance applied best to their unique situation. This overload of information and lack of tailored support seemed to continue to procrastination, or as many interviewees called it, decision paralysis. So we actually found that succession planning frequently begins after a crisis or significant event occurs, and this really then forces the family to take some action. So common triggers for this reactive planning included sudden health issues, unexpected deaths, or even major family changes like marriages. However, these immediate decisions about who would take over operations or what did management styles look like on the farm were often made under very stressful and rushed circumstances. This reactive and rushed approach often limits the opportunity for thoughtful and proactive planning and increases the risk for incomplete or rushed transitions. So how do we ensure the success in succession? So interviewees emphasize that succession should be treated as a living document, something that evolves with the farm over time rather than existing as a static, one-time plan that's stored in a binder and forgotten about. Interviewees repeatedly described how important it was to have holistic support and guidance. Holistic facilitation was about having a trusted coordinator, often called a quarterback, who can bring all the experts to the table to holistically address the legal, financial, and emotional aspects of a succession plan. So the other piece here is having practical farmer-specific resources. These are resources that are digestible and context-specific for farmers. Interviewees described how farmers value real conversations with someone who can understand their world, someone who's cut from the same cloth, so to speak. Affordability was also a very important factor when putting a formal plan in place. While there's not a one-size-fits-all solution to this, grants or even government subsidies might be an important avenue to consider in the future. So that brings us to our conclusions here. In summary, succession planning is complex. It is emotionally, legally, and financially complex. However, there is a high level of urgency that exists. And this level of urgency was echoed by our interviewees across legal, financial, and advisory roles. Despite increasing awareness of its importance, the majority of farmers still don't have a formal succession plan in place, and there are a lot of key challenges that remain. These barriers included unresolved conflict, difficult financial decisions, and even a lack of shared understanding about what succession planning means or involves. While there is a plethora of information available, including webinars and handbooks, there is still limited evidence on how well these resources are mobilized. And this brings us back to that holistic support idea again, and why it's so important. It's not just about the legal documents or the financial projections. It's also at its core very much about communication, mediation, emotional dynamics, and collaboration. The way forward needs to be agriculturally focused. Resources and advisors must understand the realities of farming and rural life. Planning must be accessible, relatable, and tailored to individual farms if we want to see meaningful, long-term application and a sustainable future for agriculture in the rural prairies. Thank you very much for your time.